Hello, welcome to Season 11 of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. This season, in each episode, we will not both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about it later. We have 10 previous seasons of doing exactly that, and it's time for something new. This season, each episode will focus on a larger horror topic, trend, or maybe even rumor. We'll speculate about upcoming movies, debate genre definitions, and do our best to apply the perspective of two people who have watched way too many horror movies to different types of horror media. Thanks for coming along for the ride. So a few weeks ago, we watched the first episode of Masters of Horror. And that was a totally new thing to both of us, and it came as a recommendation from a listener. And I remembered during the time that we were doing it, I was like just reading about the show, and I was really kind of intrigued by that concept of, you know, all these famous horror directors getting tipsy at dinner together and then somehow making a show out of that. But one thing that came up at the time was, you know, I went ahead and watched like the first 4 episodes. And it was pretty intense for made-for-TV stuff. But then I'm like, okay, well, it's Showtime, so they can get away with pretty much anything they want to, and it's fine. But I had read that there was an episode from the first season that Showtime refused to show. Mm-hmm. And that episode was called Imprint, and it was later released like in the DVD version of the shows. But you had suggested for this week that you'd heard something about a movie called Imprint, and then we looked at the reviews and they were really terrible. And I was like, oh, well, there was an imprint that sounded interesting. And so we just kind of decided to go back and revisit the last episode of season 1 of The Masters of Horror. Mm-hmm. And it is called Imprint.
Yeah, it was kind of funny how it worked out for us because we're trying to figure out, like, we have like a few ideas of, you know, what we're doing for the rest of the season, but it was one of those where I think we were both just kind of worn out, and so like almost like nothing was really sounding kind of good to us. It was like, I don't know if we want to do that, and then the imprint came up, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that's perfect, like that's exactly like what we want to do. And then reading like up on like this episode and like all the places it was like not available to be watched on in the countries, it was like, oh my gosh, okay, now we really need to watch this, you know. Yeah.
So I guess there was a DVD cover for it, and it says there's a red banner at the top that says banned from cable broadcast. Right. So I feel like even the marketing of it was really leaning into the fact that it was so controversial.
Yeah. Which is crazy. Yeah. It was only 2006 when it came out too. Like that's
Yeah, this wasn't like the 60s or something.
No. Yeah.
So, yeah. But anyway, yeah, it was interesting. And as we got into it, I realized too that this would be a good opportunity for us to talk about body horror as a horror subgenre.
Yeah.
And going back to our list from popcornhorror.com that talks about the horror genres and subgenres, they have one called gore and disturbing. And so they have everything from torture like Hostel and Saw to cannibals and splatter. And I feel like body horror is a thing that that neither of us were really super aware of until we got into the 100 Years of Horror. Mm-hmm. And I'm intrigued by it. And this was a good excuse to go back and read a little more about that, just because this was such an obvious example of it.
Right. Yeah. When that idea kind of came up too about the podcast, it's like, no, that makes perfect sense. Like that's absolutely what this was. So we might as well.
Yeah. So, super high level, this one was directed by Takashi Miike. It's Miike, and I don't know how to pronounce it.
Mike.
Yeah, but he was one of the Masters of Horror, and it was actually based on a traditional Japanese story called Boki Coyote. And he said that one of the reasons he chose to make a film from that was that it had a simplicity that he liked, and it had the kind of story that he imagined the audience telling their friends about after seeing the film. I would say he was half right, because there was nothing simple about this storyline and trying to follow it.
No, it definitely wasn't. It was one of those where like part of you kind of thought like, did some of this just get like lost in translation,
Yeah.
or whatever the case was. But, that is interesting though about the Boki Coyote, or however you pronounce it. Like,
I cannot imagine an American folk tale that is anywhere on par with how screwed up this was.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's the...
It's like, oh yeah, a story my mom used to tell me about. Yeah. The girl with the hand coming out of her head and all the murder and torture and... Yeah.
Mom, I can't sleep tonight. Can you tell me the Boki Coyote story?
Again?
Yeah. Well, there was this girl raised by her brother. Or
yeah, it was intense. But
yeah. It's interesting though. Like I really like I like hearing the folk tales of other like even like Native American tribes and just like, we have some in Oklahoma with Osage Indians and then, I'm sure there's a lot, in like the swamp South area, it's just interesting to hear because it's like, everyone's heard of like Crybaby Bridge, but have you heard of like the Little Green People or whatever, whatever the case is?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a thing that anytime we get in and get a chance to kind of dig into some of that from other cultures, that's always got like a certain novelty factor because it doesn't feel like just another remake of a movie that we've seen 100 times.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. So the general storyline on this one is that there is an American journalist who's traveling through Japan looking for, I guess like a lost girlfriend who he had met briefly when he was there before and promised to come back for her and bring her back to America. And while he's looking for her, he ends up in this like brothel island ? Is how I identified it in my notes.
Yeah.
And was asking around about her, and she had been there before, and one of the girls knew her, and so he ends up talking with her, and she talks about how, she had been tortured horribly and then eventually killed herself to escape the pain. But then she backtracks that story, and then you find out that really she had contributed to all of the above and had a really like traumatic childhood and everything from the story you find out again in a new light, and she's got like this conjoined twin that kind of lives in her head and occasionally like pushes out from her head as a hand with eyes and teeth that makes her do bad things. And it's just crazy, man. Like the more I tried to think through how all of the specifics of this story fit together, the more questions I had. But I will say, just on the whole, this was a wildly disturbing hour of television.
Yeah. Yeah. It was very, very intense. And I feel like for us to say that, especially just considering what we watched just for this podcast, like that's a statement.
Like I've seen Terra Firma.
Yeah. Yeah. This one was definitely more intense, but it was like, I felt like it took until like the very end to like understand completely what was happening, like the telling of the story, and then like the story kind of changes, and just it was a tad confusing, but like the overall story, like this was definitely a horror story inside and out, like 100%. And also like you gotta give like so much respect for the story itself, because it's like, or for the idea of this, like the idea of Masters of Horror was like, there's going to be little editing, or there's going to be little censoring of the episodes. And, I would take that as in like, okay, well, maybe we can't do this, but you're still fine doing this and this and this. But for this one, and for Showtime to be like, no, like it's not added at all. Yeah. It's just, it blows my mind. Like after some of the stuff I've seen on Showtime, this is where you draw your line. Like it was just weird for me, but it also kind of makes me want to watch some more of Takashi, his other movies.
Yeah, so that name was super familiar to me. But so I was looking back through his stuff and I couldn't find one that I was familiar with.
It was Ichi the Killer was one that we were going to do early on. And I think Audition too. Audition, I think, was one that we couldn't find.
Oh, no, we watched the Audition.
Oh, we did.
Was that on his list?
That's his, yeah.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
What was the one? Maybe it was something with noodles or something, or I can't remember, dumplings or something that we couldn't.
Yes. You're right. Yeah.
But yeah, also Itchy the Killer we were going to do, and I don't remember why we didn't, but we just didn't end up doing it for that season.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was pretty intense overall. But interesting story nonetheless, and like also it wasn't just a remake of another horror. Like I felt like it was pretty original in what it was doing, and so like naturally just from that I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty legit.
Yeah, well, and I think this one too is a really good example to use in our larger discussion about horror subgenres this season.
Yeah,
just because it really doesn't fit into killer, it really doesn't fit into monster, it really doesn't fit into paranormal, and it really doesn't fit into psychological. So that's good sort of confirmation that there is like kind of that other, gore and disturbing category. I know body horror is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and I think that this one is about as good an example as you're going to get of using that to effectively create horror and discomfort in the viewer.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is, the same vein as like Hostel or like Human Centipede, like those types of, as far as body horror goes.
Yeah.
This is just definitely right up there with those as well. I know that there were things done to the body in this that was like it tripped me out pretty bad. Like, I'm not gonna lie.
I mean, like when they were pushing those like thin wooden spikes under the fingernails and into her gums and stuff, like that is a thing that even hearing someone describe that just makes my skin crawl.
Right.
Much less actually seeing it and seeing it done in a way that is visually convincing.
And it felt like for 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
And then they were also like, this is not enough. We're going to hang her upside down and she's going to pee on herself.
Yeah.
And you're just like, what? Yeah. How is this a thing? But anyway, like they just took it. They took it to 11.
Yeah. Also, lots of bloody fetuses. Somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was there was a lot of that going on. But
yeah.
Do you know what is noted as the earliest work of body horror?
I don't.
The earliest one that I found was actually Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818.
Oh, okay.
Which body horror was not really a thing people talked about then, but looking back on it, it's like, oh yeah, she like sewed together a corpse, or like she talked about sewing together parts from a bunch of dead bodies.
Gotcha.
Into a thing that came to life and then wandered around town and attacked people. So it's like, oh yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, I can see that. Definitely using the body for horror. That makes sense.
But I think probably the more like quintessential one that everybody would refer back to is The Fly. Mm-hmm. And so that one.
Or maybe like The Blob too.
Yeah, but I guess David Cronenberg was, is highly regarded as like one of the early people to really do body horror in film.
Oh yeah.
And so he had some other movies before he did his remake of The Fly. But The Fly, I feel like a lot of things where you look up body horror refer back to that. And I think that that's really the only lens that you can make sense of that movie in.
Yeah.
Cause it's just like, and that was like prime time for practical effects and making it look visually convincing and everything else. So I think it was just kind of a right place, right time of his influence and what they were able to pull off technologically.
Yeah, and another thing I was kind of thinking of, one thing that was like when I was doing some research on it was just talking about how it's like why, like literally like. In Japanese horror, like this is super common, like body horror, which just makes sense considering this episode for sure. But then you start thinking like, well, you think of like The Ring and, just other, others that obviously aren't coming to mind at the moment, but you're like, oh, okay, no, definitely like makes complete sense. But I also, yet again, like the idea about how, like, that's their style of horror that they like, you know, like that's what, for whatever reason, that's what they, you know, that's their preference.
Well, it resonates with them.
Yeah.
Like it's a thing that is especially disturbing and effective. And so,
which is super.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know some like larger sociological explanations of why. But yeah, it's cool. It's really interesting because I feel like this one too, and by this one I mean body horror in general, has kind of a long history with censorship and controversy. Like there's something about it that just really strikes people as not just scary, but like offensive or like immoral to even depict. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, what's funny is I actually have been watching a documentary on Netflix called Age of the Samurai, I think. And it starts in like the 1500s, but basically, long story short, like up until like a certain part, I think it was like 1600s, like all like the Japanese people knew was war. Like you never really trusted the other clans. So it was just like fighting nonstop. So you literally had people when, you know, Japan became united that were kind of like like confused, like, wait, what now that we can't fight our neighbors? And so that's when they ended up taking the fight to China. But it's just like, there has to be something that's just like, you know, ingrained from like all the intensity and stuff of fighting and war that has to be tied to the body of horror, and that being their favorite. That's just my theory though.
Yeah. Interesting theory for sure. I thought that this one was I mean, the acting aside, it was a very wild story. It was very disturbing. It was very in your face, and it was very visually effective. Like I feel like what this movie was trying to do was to show you images in situations that would just absolutely make you uncomfortable and kind of grossed out and scared for your own life in a way. And it's just interesting to me that in 2006 a movie could still do that effectively. And it wasn't all just torture either. I mean, there were just a lot of like weird things happening that were very unsettling. And so I kind of appreciated that it wasn't entirely just like, you know, hostile, where it's just like torturing a person for an hour, you know?
Yeah. Cause I mean, even like the story that he got out of her, if it was true or not, like the final one of like, her life, like that in itself was messed up, and like tossing the baby into the river and realized it was still alive 2 days later. Like that was almost, for me, like equally as disturbing as like the fingernail thing and the nail, or the like their lips getting pinned, her lips getting pinned back kind of thing. And, but yeah, also, I mean, like I kind of, as far as like the frustrations specifically with this episode, really it was just more so just the acting was a little rough. It wasn't even like I definitely mean no offense to the actor, but it was the American guy that I felt like was the worst, in the sense of he just couldn't control his anger. He was just like screaming a lot.
Yeah, he was just like 0 to 60. Like, so she's like, oh no, actually she was here, but now she's dead. And he's just like, he pauses and then he's like, not a chance. That's impossible. You're a liar. Like there was just, it was just so 0 to 60 and like no transition period or like, what do you mean? Or asking for clarification. Yeah. It was just,
yeah. He just really went to town.
Yeah.
You're just like, hey man, calm down. Like, it's okay. Like, there's a weird obsession that we have here, that we have going on here. Hey, did it ever explain, like, specifically why her face was, like, kind of crooked like that?
No, unless it was a byproduct of having, like, the conjoined twin on that side.
That makes sense.
Or something. But no, they didn't, like, really.
I bet that was the case. Like, it was just because it was stretched out because of what she had up there. But
it was, like, a striking visual, for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, it was just like a constant reminder. like throughout the whole episode, you're like, yep, something weird is going to happen here. The other thing strange too, or not strange, but the other thing I thought was interesting thinking like on this series, like when I started watching the episode, I thought to myself like, okay, where's the twist and turn going to happen? But then I was like, oh wait, no, like these are different, like different directors, like these are different.
Yeah.
Like each episode's different. They're not all going to have like these crazy twists and turns like the first episode we watched did, but, would you categorize, like zombies as body horror?
I feel like they can cross over a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I feel like for sure sometimes the, like especially when I had that thought when we were watching the first episode of The Walking Dead, when they were, the zombie group was eating tearing apart the horse.
Oh yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, I guess there's a little bit of that in here too. But yeah, I definitely think so. Anything with like eating brains or any of that, and also just the fact that zombies are like sort of, I don't know, almost like mutated versions of a normal human body.
Yeah.
I think it would have some crossover for sure.
I was thinking
no, I don't think they all do. You know, like there are definitely some zombie movies where that's not like a big deal. Like the gore of what the zombie looks like, or like watching a zombie eat a person, is not like really in your face. But yeah,
I can see that too. And then I got to thinking too. I was like, I think Cabin Fever technically could be too. Like there was just a couple I was kind of thinking on, like that I felt like was. I feel like body horror, obviously, but I feel like body horror is like a lot easier to figure out than like the whole demon thing that we ran into.
Yeah.
It was just like, wait, no, that could be. I felt like that was like the whole podcast. With this one, it's like, zombies, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like Evil Dead even, had some elements of it, and maybe it's that. There are definitely a lot of other genres that use sort of the striking visuals of body horror, like as part of making kind of their main thing more effective.
Right.
But yeah, like there's definitely a lot of, overlap for sure with horror movies.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that for sure. I see that. Absolutely. That is also crazy to think about with Frankenstein. I guess I wouldn't even.
Yeah, as soon as I read it, I was like, oh yeah, obviously, but it had never crossed my mind.
Yeah.
So,
Crazy.
Yep.
Well, overall, I was pretty happy with both episodes, I guess, from Masters of Horror, but that we've decided to watch for the podcast.
Yeah, it is much more in your face and intense and like hardcore horror than I was expecting just reading about it ahead of time. It definitely goes hard, and it's almost like in that B movie kind of shock horror.
Yeah.
Which I was not expecting from a thing that was shown on TV, but I should have known Showtime has different rules. So.
Yeah. Apparently blocking this one.
Well, yeah, I guess. Even they have limits.
Yeah, which is strange.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.